Dear friends, welcome to ePathshala. I am Dr. Vishal Jadhav, Department of Sociology, Tilak Maharashtra Vidya-mitra, Pune. Today we are going to look at a module titled Partition, Communalism and Communal Riots, which is part of the political sociology paper. All of us know and have read in our history textbooks of the partition violence that took place in 1947. The communal riots that took place in which many Hindus, Muslims and Sikhs suffered. It was during this time and a little after that East Pakistan was liberated, that is in 1971, which became Bangladesh, and in this whole process lakhs of lives were lost. This particular module tries to examine the reasons for this kind of communal violence, and it asks certain basic questions as to whether communalism was imbricated in the nationalist project of Hindutva. History of the partition. While 1947 is remembered by most of us as the year in which India got independence, for many the memories of partition weigh heavier than the celebration of freedom from colonial rule. The states of Punjab and Bengal were partitioned to form West and East Pakistan, which eventually became Bangladesh, in the process displacing, injuring and killing millions of people. In a way, the year 1947 got imprinted in the minds of those Muslims, Hindus and Sikhs who were made homeless and penniless by forces of events which unfolded on the eve of independence. Remembering partition is an exercise not simply of going into the past and making objective and value neutral observations, but an effort to tread a path in which many issues regarding history, nationalism and independence are colored by overwhelming violence which is difficult to quantify. Explanations of why the subcontinent came to be partitioned have long remained trapped within the paradigms of the two-nation theory, claimed to be supported by the Pakistani side of the divide and the secular composite nationalist worldview hailed in India. Paul Brass observes that the separatist roots of the Muslim League and its call for Pakistan actually found expression in support in the Muslim minority regions of the United Provinces. It is only much later Brass observes that this minority sentiment spread to the Muslim majority provinces of Punjab, Bengal, Sindh and Northwest Frontier Province. The role of the United Provinces was especially important. It was in this great northern province that the Aligarh movement was begun, that the Muslim League was organized and that the League began the reorganization after 1937, which led to the call for a separate state of Pakistan. After the Lahore session of 1940, where the All India Muslim League passed a resolution in its three conference which demanded the creation of independent states for Muslims in West and East India. The immense popularity of the League and its idea of a separate nation were difficult to counter. Despite internal differences, the Congress came to accept the partition. In fact, among Congress leaders, Patel believed that without partition, there will be many further divisions and strife in India, which could go against the process of unification. For Ambedkar, the roots of partition were much older than Muslim League's mobilization. The social and economic marginalization of Muslims in India was one of the crucial driving factors for the demand of partition. In the summer of 1947, partition not just of territories but also resources took place. The greatest loss was on the human front, and never-ending debates on the role of various political figures in this matter seemed to hoodwink the core of the partition, which was a tragic loss of human life and dignity. The 1940s were marked by several instances of communal violence in several places in the then India. The testimony to this is that on the eve of independence, Gandhi was in Kolkata trying to bring peace in a communally charged situation precipitated by the partition. The movement of people across now hostile territories and social relations, which were abruptly imposed upon people living in towns and villages of these newly formed nations, were full of strife. The grounding of politics in religion especially put women and questions of sexuality in the forefront. As has been the history of religious and ethnic violence, sexual assaults became often used tool to demonstrate power. The collection of testimonies of Indian women affected by partition shows that violence against women was shaped on the basis of seeing women as repositories of their communities or as territories to be occupied. Hence, this kind of violence became an expression of domination over another community and underlined its humiliation. In the case of women, murder, abduction, conversion, and forced migration became signs of the moral appropriation and purification of territory and incorporation into a new state. Jalal writes that far from healing the multiple fractures which turned the promised dawn of freedom into a painful movement of separation, the march of time has in many instances cast partition historiography into a more rigid mold. The psychological legacy of partition has left a much deeper impact on people's minds than the social, economic, and political dynamics that led to the division. Whether the two dimensions should be separated quite as surgically as India was dismembered by the partitioners' acts is itself an issue of considerable disagreement among historians. Common images associated with the partition are those of trauma and devastation. Often these turn into the outcome of the societal and political upheaval of the time. Many scholars have struggled against such a linear understanding of the partition, where political figures argued and disagreed, leading people into communal frenzy and causing the greatest human displacement in human history. Over 2 lakh people were killed and over 1.4 crore people migrated during the partition. The understanding of partition as outcome has been at the center of many studies in history, political science, and political sociology. In India, the association of local territory with groups in an achievement of partition has exemplified this kind of thinking. Pandey has argued that in transferring the history of the event into history of its cause and origins, distance is created from the fearful movements of the past, a disciplinary device widely adopted by historians. Moreover, while partition historians in India have remained overwhelmingly concerned with causes, it is not sufferings nor issues of nationalism and nation building, but questions of India's unity that have motivated these concerns. In the real history of India of the late 19th and 20th century, the history of partition has thus appeared as an intrusion. This construction of Indian history sees the violence associated with partition as separate issues and the latter as an aberration. This false division is crucial in its implication, as this is the template that the understanding of communal violence post-independence also tends to take. At the core of this is perhaps an anxiety in accepting ordinary people are as motivated by violent religious ideologies in their regular lives. No wonder then the Indian post-colonial historiography, driven by the need to demonstrate the unity of India's diverse peoples and traditions, placed undue emphasis on causes. Such representations also paint a picture of the participants in these violent acts as people acting purely out of religious mobilization. But in fact, as Brass argues, much of the violence was also motivated by a host of reasons. The violence at the time of partition was also motivated by assertions and attempts at domination by 3 different communities in the northwestern region. Butalia also argues, based on testimonies, that a lot of violence also took place for material gains and control. This goes along with retributive and vengeful violence in which mobs of people participated. All this raises deep questions about the nature of communal violence. While people suffered through partition, many among them also carried out acts of violence. The victim and perpetrator were roles that shifted dynamically. The history of partition serves as a motif which is constantly reimagined into present narratives of communal politics. Further, this politics has reiterated the dubious agency exercised by individuals in incidents of communal violence. Also, the narrative of violence as rupture or aberration has come to be critiqued by many scholars. In India, partition lingers in collective imagination and has entered and shaped discourses of nation building and secularism, caste and religious identities, ideas about majority minority relations, and a range of issues touching upon refugees and trans-border migrations. In the following sections, we will examine how this narrative is played out in the politics of communalism. Besides this, the partition remains as a history and memory of loss and violence which has not withered away with time. Politics of communalism. Given the history of partition, violence, it was hoped that such deep and bitter divisions over religiously motivated politics will not reoccur in independent India. Quite contrary to that, communalism is entrenched in the body politic of independent India. The term communalism gets a specific meaning in South Asian context. It signifies political mobilization around religious and ethnic identities in order to establish domination and incite violence. Such mobilization of identity exists everywhere, but the particular brand of religio-ethnic tension that is capitalized upon by religiously conservative groups in South Asia is understood as communalism. Many scholars have concerned themselves with the nature of communal politics and the response to it in secularism. Further still, scholars like Ashish Nandy in his work, one of which is the piece Anti-Secularist Manifesto, critiques the politics of secularism, a Western concept, is unable to grasp with the cultural history of societies like India, where religion cannot be bracketed off from people's life. Further, scholars like Achin Vanayak have shown problems with the anti-secular position in dealing with communalism. In Furies of Indian Communalism, he sharply argues that scholars arguing for secularism to be a Western concept that cannot be in harmony with Indian culture only obfuscate the dangers of communalism. At the heart of this debate is the question of how civil society can fight the menace of communalism. Scholars like Engineer emphasize the role of colonial role exacerbating communal hostilities in India. The existing structures of division among religious groups were exploited in order to break mutinies against the British Empire like the one in 1857. It was easier to divide as fault lines were sharpening and communal consciousness was emerging among Hindu and Muslim elite. It is further to be noted that communal phenomena is basically an upper class elite phenomena. The Hindu elite welcomed the British rule as liberative one and began to aspire for higher administrative jobs. The communal hostilities intensified with passage of time and controversies about sharing power between Hindu and Muslim elite and constitutional arrangement for sharing power. He argues from a specific position on the subject, summarized in the statement that it must be noted that communalism is a product not of religious hostilities but of political and economic struggle for share in power and resources between the educated elite. It is not a subaltern phenomena either, as they are not involved in such struggle. Bipin Chandra says that communalism is a phenomena where the majority and minority religious ideology and practices confirms the notion of our belief alone is true and the rest is untrue or incomplete. In India, religion is the core weapon which creates the communal ideology with different practices. Communalism is seen as existing primarily between Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs and Christians. In contemporary India, communalism designates not only the conflicts between extremist religious communities. Commentators for long have argued that politicians play an important role in creating communal tension and provoking violence. Religion is deliberately used as a tool for mobilizing communal passions, and the spiritual element in religion is not given importance. Apart from the background of communal conflict during and before partition, what fuels the present day communal politics in India is also the fact that groups that were previously marginalized are gaining social mobility and asserting themselves socially. This seems to threaten the dominant position of the majority community, which is Hindus in the case of India. The response to these dynamics is layered. Communal mobilization is built around the fear of the other taking over all that is controlled by the majority community. According to Engineer, there are two categories: religious revivalism and religious fundamentalism as far as Indian socio-religious scene is concerned. In the context of religious revivalism, he includes the Babas, yogis and other religious gurus who cash in on the growing sense of insecurity, urban tensions and other stresses generated by modern industrial pattern of life. In the second category of religious fundamentalism, he includes movements like that of Vishwa Hindu Parishad and rise of Islamic fundamentalism. These movements have political aims and reflect the ideology through media. Here the religious revivalism has clearly directed political goals. A sordid culmination of communal politics in the recent history of India was the demolition of the Babri Mosque on 6 December 1992. The Sangh Parivar, an umbrella term for the right-wing Hindu nationalist organizations, mounted a campaign to demolish Babri Mosque in Ayodhya and build a temple in its place. The mobilization for this flared-up communal passion all over the country, and the demolition itself was followed by riots in Bombay and other parts of the country where thousands died. This illogic of violence and counter-violence has escalated in India. This is accompanied by economic policies that promote free market and privatization of resources and services. A culture of consumerism, along with growing aspirations of mobility, have attached with the polarization of social life. It indeed is a peculiar contradiction where modern day aspirations are combined with primordial conflicts. This new phase of the right wing is what Vanayak asks us to recognize while defending the values of secularism. Added to this mix are the changes in demographics of job and higher education, which reservations for lower caste and backward caste communities have brought about. This instability in its domination that the Hindu upper caste formations feel is translated into communal mobilizations against the Muslim other. Muslim religious conservatives also play upon the fears of the minority community. So far, the discussion on communalism has been carried out at the level of political ideology. Its manifestations in social are many, but among them, communal violence is of our greatest concern. In the next section, we will focus on communal violence and also take the discussion in a more empiric direction. Riot politics, communal violence in India. Riots, a manifestation of communal politics in a violent form, have marked much of 20th and 21st century history of India. Conflagrations between religious groups which result in mob attacks on life of property and people from different ethnic religious groups have occurred at varying scales. The months during which partition related migration was underway, riots had become an everyday phenomena. In independent India, riots in Meerut in 1982 and 1987, Bhagalpur in 1989, Bombay in 1992-93, Gujarat in 2002, Muzaffarnagar in 2013 are among those that have been reported widely because of the scale of violence and loss of lives. Beyond the pale of media and citizens' watch, many smaller instances of communalism take place on a regular basis. As many scholars have pointed out, these instances escalate around elections, revealing the relationship between communalism and politics. Wilkinson used an extensive data set on incidences of rioting throughout India to point out that riots occur significantly more often in the 6 months before or after elections. The tacit support and or complicity of state agencies in sustaining such incidents are important to note. To understand the actual embeddedness of the state, we should not just focus on the symbolic language of stateness that shapes the everyday practice of the state. we should also study the blurred boundary between the state and society as a field of power, marked by intense competition for access to state resources. Violence seems most likely in areas where there are politicians supported by local networks of extremist organizations and individuals who specialize in creating and maintaining communal tensions. These networks, according to Brass, are institutionalized riot systems. As such, actors keep communal tensions alive throughout the years through a steady infusion of communal ideology. A precipitating incident can easily be interpreted as an instance of broader communal conflict. If the activities of these networks are not kept in check, either by the police or by civic bodies, large-scale violence may develop. Both Brass and Wilkinson argue for a close relation between elections and the occurrence of violence. Economic distrust between different strata of society has taken the shape of communal conflicts in many areas during the post-independence period. Several communal riots have a background of economic issues. The worst occurrence has taken place in Bombay, Surat, Ahmedabad, Malegaon, Aurangabad, Moradabad, Pune, Meerut, Aligarh, Jamshedpur, Bhivandi commercial centers, where Muslims have managed to come up economically. In the aftermath, they were practically wiped out. He further argues that the dependence of ordinary people on political actors for securing resources often plays a role in mobilizations. Local actors participate in violence to maintain relations of patronage. In a similar manner, several socio-economic changes and distresses get masked in issues of ethnic, religious dominance, and we find propaganda being built around them. The usage of symbolism, which emphasizes threat and the need for the community to come together and defend itself, is construed from aspects of everyday life. Charu Gupta looks at communalism in the context of gender and sexuality and reveals some of the persistent forms of such propaganda. For example, Hindu propagandists emphasize on the constructed figure of the virile Muslim man against whom Hindu women have to be protected. Similarly, they argue about the catastrophic decline of Hindus due to growing conversion. The idea of women converting to Islam to marry Muslim men is the centerpiece of this anxiety, where there is not just the loss of women from the community, but also her reproductive resources get controlled by other community. Here we see a combination of the negative portrayals of Muslims as well as fears of agency of the women. Widows are the classic figure of such propaganda. The role of rumors in inciting communal enmity has been pointed by Brass and others. Rumors claiming some of the other forms of hurt or insult suffered by the majority community are a common motif in many conflagrations. Around them, mobilization is built, which often takes violent turns involving mobs damaging property and assaulting people. The role of state in supporting such acts of commission or omission further demands that there is distance between state actors and religious ideologies and organizations. Brass and Berenschot emphasize the institutional nature of riot machinery. Communal propagandists keep tensions simmering on an everyday basis, and once these tensions tip over due to an incident, the organized form of violence comes into play. The particular event which becomes the tipping point usually has multiple narratives. Organized mob violence is then sustained by what Brass calls the institutionalized riot system. Far from being spontaneous occurrences, the production of such riots involves calculated and deliberative action by key individuals. The conveying of messages, recruitment of participants, and other specific types of activities, especially provocative ones, that are part of performative repertoire. This performance gather a greater momentum around elections. Political representatives and state actors have played their own part in sustaining these riot systems. Patronage from political figures is also a reason why people participate in such mobilizations. The history of the partition, while often discussed in status terms, has its actual roots in the personal lives and memories of people. Their experiences of migration, violence, and loss exist in their personal lives and also in some ways shape how relationships between different religious communities are poised today. The violence of partition continues to animate inter-religious relations, particularly among Sikhs, Hindus and Muslims. The tendency to see violence as an aberration to partition history also continues in the way communal violence is as the unplanned action of crowds, as conflagration ignited by a spark upon a bed of combustible material. This approach fails to focus on the dynamism of riots and factors such as historical timing and the role of individuals and groups that contribute to converting events into full-scale riots. Communalism as an ideology over the years has set itself comfortably with neoliberal growth, while at the same time making the mobility of the minority backward community an object of suspicion for the majority community. The demolition of the Babri Mosque, shift to the neoliberal state policy and the revised policy for reservations for jobs and education all need to be seen together here. Organized violence is the cornerstone of this ideology, which takes performative dimensions and works itself out as a system. Socioeconomic anxieties gets wrapped up in symbolic propaganda to keep tension simmering, to be turned into riots when suitable. Not only does it garner political benefits, it becomes a conduit for ordinary people and locally powerful actors to maintain relations. An underlying thread in all these discussions is the individual agency of people committing acts of violence. This aspect is very often blurred by explaining riots as a product of frenzy created by politicians. Even during the partition, mobs attacked from people from different communities, not just out of frenzy, but for a host of reasons, including taking over property. In order to address this issue, its history and its present form need to be understood in all its dimensions. Attempt to respond to these acts of violence and the culpability of state actors in it may produce debates and differences, but first of all, its aspects needs to be understood. To conclude, we have seen that communal violence initially emerged with the idea of the two-nation theory. We have seen that the two-nation theory itself was not a very popular ideology initially, and even the large section of Muslim population did not accept this initially. However, over a period of time, this came to be naturalized, and with the partition of India, the whole idea of resources and access to resources was the main reason for violence against each other. Therefore, even in the post-independent period, communal violence is related to resource sharing, is related to the kinds of politics that goes about in politics of interest.